He made me promise silence for a lifetime, but today I'm breaking that promise. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's the truth I've hidden for years. I still remember the sound of the clock that night, the one on the wall of our old living room in the small house on Willow Street. It was past midnight, but time didn't move. The air was thick, and the silence felt alive. I was 17. My hands were trembling, pressed against my knees, and I could barely breathe. He stood in front of me, calm, composed, like nothing he was about to say would destroy my entire life. "You'll never speak of this," he said, his voice steady, almost kind. "You understand, don't you?" I nodded, though every part of me wanted to scream. My throat burned from holding it back. And that's when he made me swear that I would carry that night buried deep inside me until the day I died. The years that followed blurred into each other. I learned how to smile when people asked about my family, how to talk about the weather instead of the things that haunted me. Every morning, I'd walk past that same clock, now hanging crooked, and wonder if it remembered too. I left that house when I turned 20, moved to a small apartment in the city, and promised myself that I'd never look back. But promises are strange things. Sometimes they don't protect you, they chain you. He still called every Christmas, every birthday. And every time, I'd hear that same tone in his voice, the one that reminded me I was still bound to silence. By 2005, I thought I had rebuilt myself. I had a steady job at a bookstore on 8th Avenue, a quiet life that smelled of paper and rain. People saw me as kind, calm, dependable. No one knew that I couldn't sleep without the light on. No one knew that whenever someone said my name too softly, my chest tightened. I had learned to live around the wound, like building a house around a bomb and pretending it wasn't there. I told myself that what happened didn't define me. But deep down, I knew it still owned me. Then one morning, out of nowhere, I got a letter. No return address. Just my name, written in his handwriting. The paper smelled faintly of cigarettes, the same brand he used to smoke on the porch when he thought no one was watching. My fingers shook as I opened it. Inside, only 6 words I still remember. "Do you, too?" My knees went weak. It had been nearly 15 years. But just like that, I was 17 again, frozen in that room, under his shadow. I burned the letter, but the words stayed, carved into my mind, echoing every time I closed my eyes. That's when something inside me started to change. I began to wonder what my silence had cost me, all those years pretending to be fine, while the truth rotted inside. Maybe he had stolen my voice, but I had given him the power to keep it. I thought about the other girls in that neighborhood, about the way his gaze lingered when he thought no one noticed. And I realized I wasn't just protecting myself by staying quiet, I was protecting him. And that was a truth I could no longer live with. The decision didn't come easy. I spent weeks sitting in front of my old typewriter, the one I'd found at a thrift store when I was 22. Every time I tried to write what happened, my hands froze. The keys stayed silent, just like me. Until one night, I couldn't take it anymore. I poured a glass of whiskey, turned off the lights, and let my fingers move. The first words came like a scream I'd swallowed for decades. He made me swear silence my whole life. That was the night I began to take my story back. Writing those first words felt like tearing open an old wound that had never healed right. The sound of the typewriter keys echoed through the room, each click sharp as a heartbeat. My apartment was small, a one-bedroom on the corner of 12th and Monroe, and that night it felt even smaller, like the walls were closing in on me with every sentence I wrote. I didn't plan to tell the world. I just needed to see my truth outside of myself, to give it form, to prove it existed. But the moment I read those lines back, I realized how much I had lost trying to bury it all. 20 years of silence had turned into 20 years of pretending, and in that pretending, I'd built my own prison. People often talk about healing as if it's gentle, soft light, quiet music, slow forgiveness. But that's not how it was for me. Healing was violent. It was the sound of glass breaking in the middle of the night when I dreamed of his voice. It was waking up with my jaw locked tight from the anger I never let out. It was the guilt that came from wondering if my silence had allowed him to hurt others. I started seeing flashes of the past in random moments, a smell, a sound, a color, and suddenly I was back in that house again, trapped in the same air, hearing that same low whisper, "You'll never speak of this." It was around that time that my sister, Eleanor, reached out to me after years without contact. She said she'd found something, an old box from our childhood home, left in the attic when I moved away. I hesitated before agreeing to meet. We met at a diner near the old church, the one with flickering neon lights that made everything look half real. She looked older than I remembered, tired, hollow-eyed, carrying the same kind of pain that doesn't age well. We didn't talk much at first, just sat there listening to the hum of the fridge behind the counter. Then she slid the box across the table. Inside were old photos, birthday cards, and a single cassette tape labeled in faded ink, "Family, 1989. The moment I saw it, I felt sick. I hadn't heard that voice in decades, but even the handwriting was enough to twist something in my stomach. Eleanor said she hadn't listened to it, she couldn't. "I think it's yours to hear," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. That night, I played it on my old cassette player, hands shaking so hard the tape almost slipped. At first, it was just laughter, my mother's voice, faint and warm, my own as a little girl. Then, his voice came through .com .cheerful .ordinary. But beneath it, in the background, there was something else, a muffled cry, almost swallowed by static. I stopped the tape. The silence after it ended was worse than the sound itself. For days, I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. The tape confirmed something I'd tried to tell myself wasn't real, that what happened to me might not have been just me. Maybe that was the moment I understood. My silence hadn't protected anyone. It had hidden him, and I couldn't let that continue. But telling the truth meant burning everything. The fragile peace I'd built, the family that still pretended not to know, the illusion that time had made it all go away. So I made a plan. I decided to write everything down, exactly as it happened, names, dates, places. I wasn't sure yet what I'd do with it, but I knew that hiding wasn't an option anymore. I'd spent my whole life being afraid of the sound of my own voice. Maybe it was time to let the world hear it, even if it destroyed me. That was when I started to notice something strange, a shadow I couldn't quite place. A car parked across the street longer than it should have been. A call that hung up the moment I answered. The past, it seemed, wasn't ready to let me go just yet. It started small, so small that I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. A shadow that lingered a little too long outside my window. Footsteps in the hallway when I knew every neighbor upstairs was asleep. Once, I found the door to my apartment slightly open when I came home from work. Nothing was missing, nothing broken, but I could feel it, the air had changed. Someone had been there. For the first time in years, I felt that same icy grip on my spine, the same silent terror that I thought I'd left behind in that house. It was like the past had found its way back, walking right through my locked doors. I told myself it was paranoia, that I'd been writing too much about him, reliving too many memories, dragging old ghosts into the light. But one night, when I came home late from the bookstore, I saw it, a letter slipped under my door. No envelope this time, just a single torn page, with 6 words written in the same, unmistakable hand. "You should have stayed silent, little one." My knees almost gave out. The hallway lights flickered, and suddenly I was 17 again, trembling under his voice, the smell of cigarettes thick in the air. I ripped the paper apart, but the words were already burned into my mind. That night, I barely slept. Every sound became a warning. The creak of the pipes, the hum of the fridge, all of it made me jump. Around 3 a.m. I sat by the window, watching the rain pour down on the empty street. My reflection in the glass looked like someone else, older, hollow, haunted. That's when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. No message, no name, just a single image, the front of my building, taken from across the street. I remember whispering to myself, it's happening again, and realizing I wasn't safe anymore. The next day, I went to the police. I told them about the letters, the calls, the photo. The officer, a young man who looked barely 30, nodded politely, but his eyes said he'd heard it all before. He asked if I had an ex, someone with a grudge, maybe a misunderstanding. I wanted to scream that it wasn't just someone, it was him, the man who taught me fear, the one who had turned silence into my cage. But saying his name out loud still felt impossible. So I left the station feeling smaller than ever, clutching the report form that I knew would go nowhere. I started checking the locks 3 times before bed. I moved the typewriter into my bedroom so I wouldn't have to sit by the window at night. But I kept writing. Every word was an act of defiance now, every page a piece of the truth that he couldn't erase. I wrote about the first time I realized what he'd done, about the nights I'd hide under the kitchen table when his footsteps echoed down the hall. I wrote about the way my mother looked at him, not with love, but with the kind of silence that meant she knew, too, and chose not to see. It was while I was writing one of those scenes that I heard it, a knock at the door. Soft to soft. I froze. My breath caught in my chest. For a long moment, I couldn't move. Then, slowly, I stood up and looked through the peephole. No one was there, just an envelope on the floor. I picked it up with shaking hands. Inside, there was no note, only a photo. Me, sitting at my desk, typing, taken through my window. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about memory anymore. It wasn't the past haunting me, it was the past watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there with the photo in my lap, the rain whispering against the glass, the street outside swallowed by fog. My reflection stared back at me from the window, pale, trembling, terrified. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps. Every passing car felt like someone circling the block, waiting. I kept asking myself how long he'd been watching me. Days, weeks. Had he followed me home from the diner? The thought that he had stood outside my apartment, camera in hand, while I was inside trying to free myself from his memory, it made my skin crawl. I'd spent years running from his shadow, and now that shadow had found me again. By morning, my body felt like stone. I walked to the kitchen, made coffee, and stared at the dark liquid swirling in the cup. I thought about leaving the city, about disappearing. But then, another thought took hold, a darker one. Maybe that's what he wanted. Maybe he needed me to run, to stay afraid, to keep that promise of silence alive through fear instead of words. No, not this time. I was done running. I called Eleanor, told her everything about the photo, the messages, the feeling that he was back. She didn't sound surprised, just quiet. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. He's dying, you know, the words hit like ice water. She told me she'd heard from someone back home that he'd been in and out of hospitals. That the man who once seemed untouchable was now frail, with cancer eating him from the inside out. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to celebrate. Part of me wanted to scream that it wasn't enough. But mostly, I felt robbed of the chance to see him answer for what he'd done. He doesn't deserve to die in peace, I whispered, but even as I said it, I realized peace was something neither of us had. That night, I opened the drawer where I kept his first letter, the one from years ago, the one that said I still remember. I placed it beside the new photo. To ghost side by side. That's when I made the decision. If he was still alive, I would go back to Willow Street, back to the house I swore I'd never step into again. I needed to face him, not for revenge, but for truth. I needed him to see that I wasn't afraid anymore. The drive took 6 hours. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt. When I turned onto that old street, Everything looked smaller, the trees, the houses, even the sky. Time had faded it all, but not the memories. The house stood there, still painted that sickly shade of yellow, its porch sinking under years of neglect. I parked across the street and sat there for a long time, heart pounding, staring at the windows that once held my nightmares. Then I saw her, a woman stepping out onto the porch. Grey hair tied back, shoulders bent, eyes tired. My mother. She looked right at my car. I froze. And then she smiled. A hollow, knowing smile. I got out, every step heavier than the last. The wooden boards creaked under my weight, the air thick with dust and something else, something old, something familiar. "You shouldn't have come," she said softly as I reached the door. Her voice was calm, almost tender. "He's inside," my breath caught. I hadn't heard her voice in 20 years. "He wants to see you," she added. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. But when I looked past her, through the half-open door, I saw him, sitting in that same armchair, by that same crooked clock, looking smaller than I'd ever imagined. His eyes found mine, and time stopped. And in that silence, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't ready for what I was about to hear. He looked nothing like the man I remembered, and yet everything about him was the same. The way his fingers tapped rhythmically against the armrest, the faint smirk at the corner of his mouth, as if this was all some quiet victory. The years had hollowed him out, but the arrogance was still there, sitting heavy in the room like smoke. His skin hung loosely over sharp bones, his breathing shallow and wet. Tubes ran from his arms to a humming machine beside the chair. The smell of antiseptic mixed with dust and decay. My mother stood in the corner, silent, hands folded tightly in front of her as though she was the one being punished. I couldn't move at first. It felt like my body refused to obey me. Then he spoke. "You came," he said, his voice dry, cracking, but still carrying that same tone, that same quiet command that had once ruled my world. My stomach twisted. I wanted to tell him I didn't come for him, that I came for myself, but the words stuck to my throat. "You shouldn't have," he added. His eyes flicked toward the old clock on the wall, the same clock that had watched everything. Tick dot tick dot tick. "You broke your promise." Those 4 words sliced through the air like a knife. I felt the heat rise behind my eyes, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. "You made me promise to protect you," I said, my voice shaking. "To protect your secret." He smiled faintly, a sick, knowing grin. "And you did," he whispered. "All these years you kept it safe." The room tilted. I could taste metal in my mouth, feel the old fear crawling back up my spine. "You stole my childhood," I said quietly. "You took everything from me." He leaned back, coughing weakly, his laugh a rasp that echoed off the walls. "You think I took something," he said. "You gave it." My mother flinched. I turned to her, disbelief cutting through my anger. "You knew," I said. "You always knew." Her lips trembled, her eyes wet, but she didn't deny it. "I thought I was protecting you," she whispered. "You were a child," I snapped. "You don't protect a child by closing your eyes." The silence that followed was unbearable. The machine beeped once, twice, steady and indifferent. I wanted to scream, to tear down the walls, to make them both feel even a fraction of what I'd carried. But then something inside me shifted. I realized that this house, these people, this poison, wasn't mine to carry anymore. "I'm not afraid of you," I said finally, meeting his eyes. "Not anymore." His smirk faltered. For the first time, I saw something new, not control, not pride, fear. "You can't undo the past," he said softly. "No," I replied, "but I can stop it from haunting me." I turned to leave, my hands trembling, my heart a storm in my chest. "You won't tell them," he called out, voice breaking. I stopped in the doorway. "The world doesn't care about your story," he said. "They'll call you crazy." I looked back one last time, and for the first time, I saw him as he truly was, small, powerless, already fading into nothing. "Maybe," I said, "but at least I'll be free." If you're still here, it means you feel it too, the weight of secrets, the pain of silence. Don't look away now, this is where the truth finally comes out. As I stepped outside, the air hit me like a wave, cold, clean, alive. The sun was sinking behind the trees, painting the sky the color of rust and ash. I didn't cry. I didn't look back. I just walked. And for the first time since I was 17, I didn't hear the clock ticking. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Because when you speak the truth, the world doesn't just listen, it reacts. And sometimes it pushes back. 2 weeks after I left that house, I published my story. I didn't tell anyone, not Eleanor, not even the few friends who still checked on me from time to time. I uploaded it under my real name, no pseudonyms, no disguises. For years I had hidden behind silence, behind shame. But this time, I wanted the truth to have a face. I titled it The Promise of Silence, and when I hit post, my hands were trembling so badly I almost deleted it right after. I went to bed thinking no one would read it, that it would disappear into the void of the internet like everything else. But the next morning, the world was already watching. The emails came first, hundreds of them, then thousands. Some were from strangers who had lived through their own nightmares, thanking me for putting into words what they never could. Others were from reporters, from people who wanted details, names, proof. And then there were the messages that chilled me, short, cruel, anonymous. Liar, you wanted it. He's dying and you're still trying to destroy him. For every voice that believed me, another wanted me to vanish. I'd expected disbelief, but not the violence that came with it. Still, something inside me refused to back down. After decades of being quiet, I was finally being heard, and no amount of hate could drown that out. A week later, a journalist reached out. Her name was Marissa Cole, from the Boston Ledger. She said she had been investigating similar cases from the late 80s, and that my story connected dots she'd been chasing for years. When she showed me the files, photos, court documents, sealed reports, I realized I wasn't the only one. There were others. Girls from the same neighborhood. Different names, same pain. Some of them had tried to speak. None had been believed. The pattern was horrifying. It wasn't just him, it was a network of silence, a chain of people who looked the other way. Teachers, neighbors, even a pastor. My stomach turned as I read through the pages. All those years, all those lives shattered, and I had thought it was just me. The article went live 3 days later. The headline burned across every screen. The man behind Willow Street, a legacy of silence. My phone didn't stop ringing. People I hadn't spoken to in decades suddenly wanted to talk. Family members demanded I take it down. "You're killing him faster," one relative wrote. "You're killing us all," but I didn't stop. I couldn't. For every person who hated me, 10 others found the courage to speak. Survivors from across the country sent their stories. Some cried through voice messages. Others just said thank you. And somewhere in that flood of voices, I found mine again. But with the light came new shadows. I started noticing cars following me again. Different ones this time, darker, quieter. Marissa warned me that people high up didn't want this story spreading. That the truth wasn't just personal now, it was political, financial, dangerous. I didn't care. Fear was a language I no longer spoke. But deep down, I could feel something building, something that wouldn't end quietly. The night before the documentary aired, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but some part of me knew who it was. A faint, rasping breath came through the line, followed by a voice I thought I'd never hear again. "You think you've won," he said, coughing, "but you'll regret this." His words cracked like dry wood. I didn't speak. I just listened as his breathing grew weaker, the line filling with static. "You broke your promise," he whispered, barely audible. Then silence. I waited for the click of the call ending, but it never came. Only that heavy, hollow static, until finally there was nothing. The next morning I got the news. He was gone. But the silence that followed didn't feel like peace. It felt like the beginning of something else. The morning light felt wrong. Too bright, too calm, as if the world had no idea what had just happened. I woke up to a dozen missed calls, journalists, relatives, unknown numbers. His death had already made the news. Local man, age 74, passes away after long illness. No mention of what he had done, no mention of the lives he ruined. Just a quiet, respectable obituary, like he'd lived a decent life. I stared at the article, the photo of his face, pale, frail, framed by kind words, and my stomach turned. I wanted to feel relief. Closure. Maybe even freedom. But what I felt instead was a deep, hollow ache that spread through my chest like cold water. Because no matter how loudly I had spoken, death had silenced him before justice ever could. That afternoon, I walked to the park near my apartment, the same one I used to visit on sleepless nights. The wind was sharp, carrying that faint metallic scent of rain. I sat on a bench, hands buried in my coat pockets, trying to breathe. Around me, life went on, children laughing, dogs barking, people scrolling through their phones. No one knew the kind of war that had just ended inside me. I thought about the years he'd stolen, the nights spent afraid of the dark, the version of myself that never got to exist because of him. I wanted to let it go, to release it into the air like smoke. But trauma isn't smoke. It doesn't drift away when the fire dies. It lingers, heavy, invisible, waiting. Marissa called that evening. Her voice was gentle, but I could hear the tension underneath. "Are you okay?" she asked. I wanted to say yes, but the truth caught in my throat. "He's gone," I finally said. "Then it's over," she replied softly. But we both knew it wasn't. When she told me the documentary was scheduled to air in 2 days, I hesitated. "Do we still release it?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. I thought of all the girls in those files, all the names that had been buried just like mine. "Yes," I said finally. Especially now, the day the documentary aired, I sat alone in my apartment, watching my story unfold through a stranger's lens. They had filmed the house on Willow Street, the cracked windows, the broken porch. They showed my voice distorted, faceless, telling what happened in the same room where I'd lost everything. Seeing it from the outside was surreal. It wasn't just my story anymore. It was a pattern, a wound carried by too many. And when the credits rolled, I realized something. This was no longer about revenge. It was about reclamation, of power, of truth, of voice. But peace still didn't come. The night after it aired, my inbox exploded again. Support, hate, threats, confessions. One message stood out. No name, no signature, just a short sentence that froze my blood. He wasn't the only one. I read it over and over, my heart pounding, a chill crawling up my spine. At first, I thought it was just another cruel message. But something about the wording, the way it was written, the tone, felt different. It wasn't taunting. It was warning. I stared out my window, the city lights flickering in the glass, and for the first time, I realized my story wasn't finished. The man who destroyed my childhood was dead, but the silence he built, the system that allowed him to exist, was still very much alive. And now that I had broken my promise, I wasn't sure if the silence would ever stop watching me. For 3 nights, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, that message burned in my mind. He wasn't the only one. The words crawled under my skin, whispering possibilities I didn't want to face. Who sent it? Someone who knew. Someone who had seen what I hadn't. My first thought was paranoia, the kind that had followed me for years, but something about it felt deliberate, too precise. The tone wasn't cruel or mocking, it was scared. Like someone trying to speak without being seen. I checked the email's metadata, hoping for a clue, but it was sent from an encrypted address. No trace, no name, just silence. 2 days later, Marissa called again. Her voice was rushed, uneasy. "Did you get a message?" she asked before I could even say hello. I froze. "What message?" I asked carefully. "The same one I did," she said. Same words. Same timing, my chest tightened. "Who sent it?" I asked, but she didn't know. "I think someone's trying to tell us something, or warn us." That word, warn, hung heavy in the air. She said she was digging through the files again, looking for connections we might have missed, names that didn't match the story we thought we knew. When she hung up, I sat in the quiet, staring at the walls. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. My window was open, just slightly. The wind moved the curtain like a slow breath. I hadn't opened it. That night, I pushed my dresser against the door and sat on the floor with my laptop, reading every article about the case I could find. Old records, police reports, newspaper clippings, things I'd tried to avoid before. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I found it, an archived story from 1991, barely a paragraph long. Local teacher accused of misconduct found dead in his home. Case closed due to lack of evidence. The address stopped me cold, 3 blocks from Willow Street. I whispered the street name aloud like a curse. It wasn't just him. There had been others. The house I grew up in was part of something much larger, something that reached far beyond our small neighborhood. By morning, I drove to the local library, where the microfilm record still lived, dusty reels of forgotten truths. The librarian looked at me strangely as I asked for access. I spent hours scrolling through old headlines, piecing together a puzzle no one wanted solved. Each article pointed to the same pattern: accusations silenced, families moved, witnesses vanishing. And one name appeared again and again, always on the periphery: a retired officer named Harold Green. He had handled every one of those cases. His name was in my mother's old letters, too, mentioned once. Harold helped us. We owe him everything. My hands trembled as I copied the name into my notebook. Marissa needed to see this. But before I could call her, my phone buzzed with a message. Unknown number again. Only 2 words this time. Stop digging. I felt the air leave my body. My reflection in the screen looked like a ghost, pale, hollow, exhausted. For the first time in months, I felt real fear again. Not the kind that lives in memories, but the kind that breathes. The kind that means someone is watching. I called Marissa anyway, my voice shaking as I told her what I'd found. She went quiet for a long time, then said softly, "Meet me tomorrow. Bring everything." Her tone carried something I hadn't heard before: dread. As I hung up, I realized that uncovering the truth had never been about surviving the past. It was about surviving the present. And the silence I'd broken was beginning to answer back. I met Marissa the next morning at a small cafe on the edge of the city, the kind with cracked tiles and coffee that tasted faintly of burnt sugar. She slid a folder across the table to me, her hands shaking slightly, eyes darting to the street every few seconds as if someone was following. Inside were photographs, letters, police reports, decades of carefully hidden evidence connecting dozens of cases, all with the same pattern: young girls, promises of silence, families complicit, men in power excused. I stared at the pages, my heart pounding. Each file was a blow, each photo a reminder of every fear I had carried silently for 20 years. The scope of it, the sheer enormity, was almost impossible to comprehend. Marissa leaned closer, her voice low. "This isn't just him," she said. "It's a network. People who've spent their whole lives covering for each other. Some of these men are dead, but many are still alive, still powerful, still protected." My hands tightened around the folder, knuckles white. I realized then why the messages had come, the warnings. The silence I had broken was just a small part of a much larger system. Every step I took, every word I spoke, was now under scrutiny. And yet, despite the fear, despite the weight of what I was seeing, I felt a spark, a stubborn, burning determination that I wouldn't stop. I owed it to the girls who never got to speak. I owed it to myself. For hours, we pored over the files, cross-referencing names, dates, addresses. One particular case made my stomach turn. A girl named Rachel, 16, from a town only a few miles from mine. Her story mirrored mine in horrifying detail, the same manipulations, the same threats, the same promise of silence. And in one of the reports, there was a note in the margin, "Watch her. She will not stay quiet." My throat tightened. Someone had known, maybe still knows, that someone like me would eventually speak. And now I was realizing that speaking wasn't just about me anymore. Every word had consequences. Every revelation could trigger others to act, for justice or for vengeance. By nightfall, Marissa and I left the cafe, carrying the folder between us like a fragile, dangerous flame. As I walked to my car, I noticed a figure standing across the street, barely visible in the dim light. They didn't move as I approached. My pulse spiked. I stopped, heart hammering. The figure disappeared into the shadows as I blinked. It was impossible to tell who it was, but I knew it had been waiting, watching. The warnings weren't empty. Someone, or more than one person, wanted this story buried, and they weren't afraid to remind me. Driving home, I kept replaying every moment in my mind, every choice that led me here. The years of silence, the manipulation, the fear, the impossible promises, they all felt like chains I had been dragging across decades. And yet, for the first time, I understood the power of breaking them. The truth was bigger than any one person, bigger than the house on Willow Street, bigger than the man who had once terrified me. And even though I wasn't safe, I was alive, and my voice, finally, was unstoppable. I got home that night and sat at my desk, hands hovering over the keyboard. I knew what I had to do. I had to finish the story, document everything, connect every dot, and make sure the world saw the truth. The risk was enormous, but the cost of silence was far greater. Somewhere in the quiet, I felt a presence, not fear this time, but resolve. The shadows may have followed me, but now they were facing a voice that refused to be quiet. The morning I decided to release everything, the sky was heavy with rain, that grey, suffocating kind that seems to pause the world. I sat by the window, the same way I used to as a child, staring at the streets below and wondering how silence could hold so much weight. But this time, there was no fear left to hide behind. The folder from Marissa sat open beside me, its pages marked with years of pain, injustice, and names that had escaped accountability for decades. I uploaded every file, every photo, every recording to a secure drive, then to multiple journalists and organizations that I knew couldn't be silenced. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from release. For the first time in my life, I was choosing to speak, no matter who listened, no matter who tried to stop me. An hour later, the first calls started coming in. Reporters, survivors, strangers, voices trembling, crying, thanking me. They had stories too. Some had been waiting their whole lives to tell them, just like I had. What began as my confession had become a movement. The network that once thrived in the shadows was suddenly dragged into the light. Names that once carried power now carried guilt. Institutions scrambled, families denied, and justice, slow, imperfect, but real, began to move. I watched it all unfold from that same window, the rain streaking down the glass like the ghosts of all those years finally weeping their way out of me. I wasn't alone anymore. I never had been. That night, Marissa called. Her voice was softer, calmer, different. "They're listening," she said. "They're finally listening." I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I felt this quiet, aching peace settle in my chest. I walked outside, barefoot on the wet pavement, and looked up at the sky. The air smelled like earth and endings. And somewhere deep inside, I whispered to the girl I once was, the one who had been told to stay quiet, to obey, to disappear. "You did it. You're free now." The silence that used to haunt me was gone, replaced by the sound of rain, cars, laughter, life. But freedom didn't mean forgetting. Some nights I still wake up to the echo of that voice, his voice, reminding me of the promise I once made, the promise of silence. And every time it comes, I answer the same way, not anymore, because silence may have protected him, but breaking it saved me. And maybe, just maybe, it will save someone else too. Now, years later, when people ask me why I told my story, I tell them the truth, because secrets rot in the dark, but truth, even when it hurts, lets you breathe again. The world didn't end when I spoke, it began. And though I carry the scars of what was done, I no longer carry the shame. He made me swear silence for a lifetime, but I chose to break that vow for every life he touched, every voice that was stolen. And in that choice, in the courage to speak, I finally found what I had been searching for all along, not revenge, not closure, but peace.